I think we can get started now. Thanks everyone for coming. Welcome to the 13th annual EcoFair. We're delighted to have you join us today. My name is Lee Adamson, and I'm one of the many volunteers organizing this year's event. And I particularly want to welcome you to this fabulous workshop organized and moderated by Brianne White, and she'll be taking over in just a minute. But she's organized quite an interesting panel to talk about eco-anxiety in youth. So I'm very much looking forward to this, as I'm sure you are. So I'll pass it right over to Brianne, who is a lead organizer with For Our Kids Toronto. Brianne?
All right. Thanks so much, Lee. I will say I did not organize this by myself. Thank you to Anne, Kiri, and a few of our members, and Amy from Carbon Conversations TO for their help. But yes, my name is Brianne White. I will be your moderator for today. Like Lee said, I'm an organizer with For Our Kids Toronto. We're part of a national network of parents and allies working together for climate justice for all kids and for future generations. So although we are coming together virtually today, I know that many of us, myself included, are residing in Toronto. So I'll begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you on the treaty lands and territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee nations. Toronto is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and I am grateful to live and work on these treaty lands. The reason for our meeting today is to ultimately move ourselves and others from worry into action toward climate justice. And so it is important for us to recognize that many Indigenous communities are experiencing the harshest impacts of the climate crisis and are often on the front lines defending people, land, and water. As a settler on this land, I am committed to ensuring that my actions as a climate organizer are in support of local Indigenous climate justice efforts, and that I learn from the incredible leadership from Indigenous activists such as the Six Nations Land Defenders and the Porcupine Warriors, currently organizing in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en people. So a little bit of context before we start. Today's panel discussion is about eco-anxiety, its impact on youth in particular, and how we can move from anxiety towards action. I would like to start by acknowledging the relationship that white people have to the term climate anxiety, and the need to ensure we never lose sight of the disproportionate effects climate change has on racialized peoples. As a predominantly white panel, we must also acknowledge the compounding effects of the racism and colonialism experienced by Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities, and that their voices are missing at this table today. If you are a white person who has perhaps not considered this perspective before, we do encourage you to do some learning about these issues. Links to helpful resources will be provided in the resource page that we'll put into the chat. And talking about the chat, it will be open during today's discussion. We invite you to introduce yourself in the chat or share resources you think might be relevant to other participants. We will also be taking a couple of questions from you a little later in the discussion. So if you'd like to suggest a question, please put it in the chat, and our chat monitor will choose a couple to be discussed. Lastly, but we'd like to note that we are a panel of community members, not therapists or experts in psychology. But even though we are not experts, our lived experience and our personal insights can be helpful to others who are dealing with complex emotions with climate change and taking action. So a tiny bit of housekeeping before we start. Please keep your microphones muted during the presentation to reduce background noise. Also, unless you're a panelist, make sure your camera is off, as it will help to make sure that people speaking can be seen and will be less distracting for viewers. If you change your view in the top right corner to the speaker view, it will automatically spotlight who is speaking for you, or you can just keep it in the gallery view and you'll see all tiles at once. Also remind panelists another time that they can jump in to add to the discussion as we go, just like you would a normal conversation. So let's get down to it. So introductions, enough of me talking. I'd love for panelists to introduce themselves. So let's get to know each other a little bit. So panelists, can you please introduce yourself with your name, maybe a little bit about you and what kind of climate work you're currently involved with. And I will start today with Roxy. So Roxy Cohen, on to you.
Thanks, Brianne. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Roxy Cohen, and I'm based in Toronto, Toronto as well. By ways of kind of introducing myself, I am a Jewish settler on these territories, and following the guidance of Nikki Sanchez, I traced that through my grandmothers. So my grandmother on my father's side is from England and has lived on the traditional territories of the Seminole, the Calusa, and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And my maternal grandmother was born and raised on the traditional territories of the Nipissing and the Abenaki. I have been engaged in the climate crisis since I first learned of it in high school. I co-founded my eco club at my high school and pushed for changes at that level. I've been part of social movements from Occupy through supporting Fridays for Future ever since then, and have kind of taken up a number of different directions in climate work, but predominantly I've been focused on creating spaces for young people to be able to articulate and practice the world that we want to live in. So if climate change is the future that we don't want, what is it that we do want, and how do we step into that future? So I co-founded a youth summer camp called Conscious Minds Cooperative and Camp, that is a 2-week space for young people to do just that in an intergenerationally supported space out in the woods. And most recently, as part of my PhD work, I have co-founded a new youth certificate program out of York University with 6 partner organizations, including Fridays for Future, Generation Chosen, and David Suzuki Foundation, among others, that is looking to uplift young leaders and really orient them with the resources, the skills, and build their networks and relationships that will kind of empower them and propel their climate work forward. I'm turning 30 soon, so I'm on that kind of edge. I'm no longer a youth, I'm becoming an adult, but I'm still kind of on the line. So forgive me if throughout this presentation I go back and forth between talking about myself as a youth and also myself as an adult supporter. I feel like I'm both this year. And I'll leave it there. And Brianne, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you so much, Roxy. I love that straddle point you're at. That's a great place to be in for this discussion. Elliot Ingram, can we pass it on to you for introductions?
Sure, thank you. My name is Elliot Ingram. I also live in Toronto. I am a grade 11 student at Upper Canada College in Toronto, and I am this year the vice president of the school's Sustainability Council, where we really work on introducing new sustainable actions into our community and awareness and education. And aside from that, outside of the school, I am involved in the Canadian Youth Climate Action Team, or YCAT. And this is my first year joining that, so I'm getting more and more involved each year, it feels like. And yeah, some of my projects I'd say that I'm working on right now or have in the past with my school council is I created the Sustainability Podcast, where we record bi-weekly episodes just to create a conversation around sustainability, not necessarily diving in deep to science or different facts and numbers, but just creating a conversation for our school environment, because it's definitely something that is lacking and we want more of. And then this year, my project is to create a wellness garden on the school campus for students to use the counseling offices, but also, as a lot of research shows, be outside and have an impact, a positive impact on their well-being. So yeah, that is me. I'll pass it back.
Wonderful. Thanks, Elliot. On to you, John Paul.
Thank you, Brianne. Yes, my name is John Paul Kleiner. I too am based here in Toronto, West Central Toronto. I am a parent, father of a teenage daughter. She is the primary impetus to my getting involved with climate action activism, which I do through For Our Kids. I've been involved for about a year or so and contributed to a couple of the different campaigns we've been involved in. Most of the activity that I've done, I'm in the Davenport riding, has been around lobbying our MP and trying to make connections with my neighbors on climate issues and getting them to support me in that work. So it's nice to be involved here today. Thanks for the invitation, Brianne, and thanks to everyone for attending.
Thanks, John Paul. And Danielle, on to you.
there. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Danielle Kwan. I use she, her pronouns. I am a first-year student at the University of Guelph. So I am kind of going back and forth, living in so-called Mississauga and Guelph. I'm studying environmental science. In terms of climate action, I've been involved with the Toronto chapter of Fridays for Future for about 2 years now, I'd say. And right now I'm working on coordinating the CARE program, which is an interactive workshop that we're trying to get into high schools, discussing, our future climate possibilities, but also how students can make meaningful action in a way that feels like it uses their own talents and using their own skills. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you, Danielle. Okay, I'm so excited to speak to you all today. Elliot, I'm going to throw our first question to you first as a starting point. So one of the reasons we decided to do this panel was because of the study that was published this past September that looked at how youth experience climate anxiety in relationship to government response to the climate emergency. So 10,000 youth ages 60 to 25 in 10 countries were surveyed. Of those, 59% felt very or extremely worried about climate change, and 45 felt that their anxiety about the climate crisis was impacting their daily ability to function. The most commonly chosen emotions about climate change were sad, afraid, anxious, angry, and powerless. Those surveyed rated government response to the climate crisis negatively and felt greater feelings of betrayal than of reassurance. So Elliot, just as a starting point, as a high school student, how does that study resonate with you? Is climate change and eco-anxiety something that is talked about amongst your peers or felt by you, or maybe was an impetus for your involvement? Or
Yeah, so I think we hear a lot of research and data and when talking about this subject, but at least personally, I find that each time you hear the exact numbers, it still is kind of impactful and resonating. And I think that those conversations are definitely had in communities I'm a part of and interactions that I've had with fellow people who are passionate about the environment and worried about the future. And I think, especially at this age, when we're starting the process of look for what universities you want to go to, or where do you want to live, what do you want to do in your life, it's almost a different conversation because there's a whole nother element that we have to consider versus students prior to us and years graduating prior to us. We have to think about, okay, do I want to live here, or is this going to be safe, or do I need to have access to these resources specifically? And it's the little things that you don't even realize that you're almost already thinking about. At least I know. And I think especially the feeling of betrayal and powerless is really important, because I was having this conversation with the teacher head of our sustainability council, and we were talking, and we both noticed how when we had the coronavirus outbreak and the start of the pandemic, all of government officials, most, decided to look towards the science and look towards the data and have that be the way to navigate what's the best plan forward. But yet there is this science, there is this data, there is this research for another crisis, much bigger, going on about the safety of our planet, but yet where there still hasn't been as much action, or there's been no speed or sense of urgency. And especially, I think at the high school level, what I can speak on is, we can't vote. So we try to do our best to say, look, these are what we're worried about. These are the concerns, and we see the science, but we can't vote, and then no one would listen to us. And then it's just this back and forth of, well, what can we do? So then you're almost feeling sad about, am I supposed to be doing something that I'm not? Like, what am I not getting here? What is going wrong? Because it feels simple. It feels like, you have this whole generation, like you said, the 59 or whatever the number was percent of people who are saying, look at this, look at our concerns, but yet you're still not getting any response back to you. So it feels almost like you're doing the wrong thing, and it feels like, what is the right thing to do almost? So I think the really important elements there were the feeling of betrayal and sadness, because it knocks you down almost, just thinking you're going to do all these things, you want to be involved, you want to get the work done, and then for people to just not listen or not care almost. So yeah, that would be my comment, if anyone wants to add on to that.
Thank you,
I
Elliot.
would definitely like to add on that, just from a youth perspective, because I find, along with the feeling of betrayal, there's also like the feeling of helplessness is already very prevalent, because as a youth, we're not being listened to in the sense of, oh, well, get your education first, and after education, and then it's like build work experience. And so when will it ever be enough, right? And the climate crisis is such an immediate issue that it feels like you're running out of time, but we don't have time to spare. Yeah, exactly. Brianne says time, or I'm not sure if that was for Elliot, but definitely time is a big thing, where it's like, I feel like I need to grow up faster, but I physically can't, and I can't get all this experience in time for like the action that we need.
Yeah, and actually, Danielle, this sort of goes into sort of the next thing I want to talk about, because you're sort of straddling these 2 points, right? And like in one aspect, from what you're saying just now, you're identifying as a youth and you're worrying about this stuff and you're trying to plan for your future, but you're also coordinating the CARE program, right? And trying to go into schools and bring climate education and climate action, inspire other students to act. So I'm sort of wondering, curious, like in this staying in the school kind of arena, what do you see that's actually happening in schools when you're going into schools and coordinating that program? How are schools addressing climate change or the anxiety people are struggling with? And maybe what would you like to see happen?
I think definitely in my experience in high school, like in a public high school, I think sort of the emotion isn't really addressed all that much. I find a lot of the time science teachers, for example, they'll like put on a short film about whatever ecological disaster, and they're just sort of like, yeah, the world's like that, right? Where we don't take time to like sit down and like be like, okay, this is something that's really a really heavy emotion for me. And I think the most powerful thing that teachers can do is like create a safe space for their students, in the sense of like process this emotion, but get down to why you're feeling it in the first place. It's because you care, right? And I think caring is really the first step to taking proper action, right? So I would love to see more I know it's hard sort of in especially a high school environment. People don't want to talk about their feelings in front of their friends, but I think definitely creating those spaces would be something I'd love to see. But in terms of like the curriculum, I would love to see like bigger picture thinking, in the sense of, I think some people might feel anxiety because they're like, this is my fault, when I think that is definitely something that's not true. Usually the people who are the least responsible are feeling the biggest effects of the climate crisis. So sort of taking away that source of stress would be good for students. But I also think teachers providing meaningful resources and ways to take action in their lives, because I find in public schools politics is sort of like right, and I understand why they can't endorse anything really in public schools, but I'd like to see sort of like ways students can make meaningful climate action.
Thanks, Danielle. Roxy, I'm curious what you're thinking right now, because this is very much in the vein of what you are doing and thinking about, I'm sure, all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so much resonance with what Elliot and Danielle have shared. I mean, I think just picking up on something that Danielle was just sharing around the emotional side of this work, of being kind of confronted with climate change. And I know that experience you just described, Danielle, that was my introduction to climate change too. I got sat down in a class, shown a series of scary documentaries about, you know, the 10 poisonous things that you didn't know were inside your home, and the 5 ways the earth might, you know, be devastated before you turn 40 and have your own kids. And that's just where it ends. And I think this piece around creating space to process the emotions and to understand those emotions as information, right? When we feel emotions, like that's information for us, that something's going on that we need to address. There's something, like Danielle said, that we care about. There's something maybe that needs to change, that we need to kind of focus on. And being able to kind of embrace those emotions as information for us that we can then kind of take seriously and decide where to act. And, you know, that grief space doesn't really exist in schools. And I think a lot of that, Danielle, I mean, also pointed to, like, we can't have controversy in the school spaces, right? We can't have controversy in public schools. And I think a part of this conversation is also the ways in which climate change and climate emotions have been actively pushed out of schools through right-wing lobbying and the oil industry. And, you know, we can see there's memos. We can go back and read the kind of, you know, the memo from BP Oil in 2006, where they intentionally put $100,000 into a disinformation campaign against teachers to say, don't teach this in school. This is controversial. And I think one of the key takeaways from this climate anxiety report is to say, actually, not addressing these emotions is controversial. And not talking about it in our schools. I think they even named, I mean, the report went quite extreme in its language sometimes, and names that this is, you know, it's almost torturous to youth to not address climate change. And it's torturous to show videos and to tell them the extent of the problem, and then not have any support around processing emotions, processing grief. And I mean, I'll get to this later, but, you know, actually kind of tapping into resources to do something about it. And maybe I'll just leave it there, but yeah, that creating those spaces for emotional processing in a positive way, I think, is an incredibly important part of this conversation.
Thank you so much. I love that emotions are information, so critical. We have a little bit of time left on this question. I'm wondering if Jean Paul or Elliot, there's anything that you want to add here.
I mean, I will say one of the things that I've found personally interesting is this discussion of sort of betrayal, the feeling of betrayal, is that how little I've actually seen that and felt that as a middle-aged person. I acknowledge that it exists, but it has been successfully sidelined in much of the communications around this. I have a teenage daughter. She is, you know, as I say, she was the motivation for my getting involved. And it was a very pointed question that she asked me a couple of years ago, you know, well, if everybody knows that climate change is so terrible, why doesn't anybody do anything about it? And, you know, as a parent, you hear that question and you are spurred to action. But I am absolutely amazed the extent to which my generation, which is basically Generation X, seems to be getting off fairly scot-free. I would expect there to be much more intergenerational conflict, and I have a feeling that's coming down the pike, frankly, that those feelings will be articulated much more directly, and that families will begin to feel them. And that's, you know, totally understandable. But that's kind of my observation here is I haven't seen it and felt it yet. I mean, I will say the one thing where I felt that it cut through the noise was, you know, hearing of this movement of young women pledging not to have children. I will say that is stark and resonates, you know, for anyone, but especially parents. When you hear young women making that pledge, totally understandable, but that resonates. And I think that, you know, this desire for consensus and keeping things comfortable and safe, it serves certain emotional needs as humans, but also we're facing a radical challenge. And a radical response is probably what's necessary, demanded of us. And as Canadians, I know that's definitely outside of most of our comfort zones, but that's sort of my reaction.
So what do you think, John Paul, like, you're a parent, I'm a parent too, I have a 2-year-old. So I know these feelings very well. This feeling of, your kid is sort of spurring you to action, but what is the role of parents in this? I mean, there's definitely this sense of responsibility and this injustice, like you're pointing to, in terms of, these youth are really the ones who are shouldering or mantling the leadership on climate action here. As parents, I think our instinct is to kind of console and make our kids feel better and not make them worry. And so many parents are afraid of making their kids stressed, right? Or causing their kids distress or pain. But as you said, we're in a radical time. We need some radical action. What are parents to do here?
That's right. Yeah. And I think we need to acknowledge like that the study points us in the direction. Our children are having these feelings. This is not some sort of fringe group. This is 60%, are identifying this. So, I mean, as a parent, I guess the first thing is, the emotional and physical health and well-being of our children is in the foreground, and trying to be sensitive to when those feelings are there and validating those feelings and, acknowledging them and letting your child know that in many ways you share them, right? I mean, I think that is an important thing for our kids to hear. We need to talk about these things. But I think that what I've found, that has been productive is literally to become productive. It's one thing to speak, but to demonstrate to my daughter my love for her and care for her peers and the future of this planet is to do something, right? And she has actually said that to me, and that makes you feel good as a parent, but it tells me, okay, this is the right thing to do. And so that can take many different forms. I also think that we have to speak out in our communities, in our families, and our friends. And that's, again, something that's very difficult to see. It's remarkable how reluctant many people are to have these conversations still. But we have to, walk the walk and talk the talk. And then I think what we found in our little family is to sit down together and examine our lifestyle, our way of life, and make those changes that I think many of us have made and sort of commit to them collectively. That's also been a powerful thing for us. So I guess those are my thoughts on that.
Thanks, John Paul. Anybody else want to jump in on the role of parents? I'd be very interested to hear other perspectives from people who are not parents or from youth themselves, what you're kind of thinking about the role of parents in this. I mean, I'll say for myself, as I was worried about the environment for a long time, but it wasn't until I was looking at my baby lying in his crib asleep that I would just look at him and bawl, hanging over his crib, thinking like, what have I done? What have I done? I brought you into this world, and what am I going to do about it, right? What am I going to do about it? And I think, I as a parent, but also as an elementary school teacher, I feel what a lot of you are saying, Danielle and Roxy, about our students and our children are looking to us like, hello, can you do something here? Don't just tell me about it and pat me on the shoulder and send me away. Like, what are we going to do to help me do something? I think it's that taking action piece, John Paul, that you mentioned, which is so critical, right? It's like sweeping under the rug doesn't help those feelings. What helps those feelings is seeing that all these people in your lives, the grown-ups in the room are listening, are doing something about this, right? They're not pretending it doesn't exist. Sorry, Danielle, go for it. I saw you just.
Yeah, if I could just chime in if there's time, because I just wanted to add on to, because I really agree with what you guys are saying, and older generations, taking meaningful, proper climate action, because as a youth, when I see, other adults, they're having conversations, but they're not doing actual action, it's like, well, then the responsibility is put on me. I find in a lot of youth organizing spaces where this isn't fun. This isn't something I want to be doing. Of course I care about it, but it's not something that I should have to be doing at my age. I shouldn't have had to be organizing rallies at 16 because no one would listen to us, right? Because no one was doing anything. We had to become the adults, right? The adults weren't helping us, so we had to help ourselves, right? And I think that's an experience amongst many youth that we should start to acknowledge more.
Thank you. Yeah. Roxy, just switching gears a little bit, I'm going to kind of point something in your way now. So you're currently working on your PhD in climate change education, and you've worked in many capacities, as you sort of outlined, including in the program you've created at York University called Rooted in Rising, the certificate program that empowers youth climate leaders. I wish I could go back in time and take that. Sounds so cool. Can you talk a little bit about climate anxiety and the path to climate justice? And I'm really trying to get at kind of how we take these feelings and make sure that they are channeled into action, right? And how we make ensure that our emotions about climate change propel us into the kind of action that builds a more just world for all, not just kind of maintaining the status quo for the sort of white, population or the privileged. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yes. Oh my gosh. So many things are coming to me to share. I mean, I think I want to take a step back and go back to a piece of what Elliot shared in his first share with us today, where they were talking about, what do I want to do with my life and where do I want to live? And these kind of core identity questions. What are my gifts? What do I have for this world that kind of youth naturally face and go through? And the impact of climate change on that process. I actually want to read a little quote to kind of frame it. This is so in the Rooted in Rising program, one of the things that we do early on is kind of have this conversation around, can we identify the future that we do actually want to live in so that we can start to kind of move onto that pathway? And, one of the key ideas that came up across all of our youth participants was this desire to have a free life where they can just be curious and have space to just exist. And one of our students, she shared this piece where she said, I just want to have time to be curious and exist. And so far, I've been feeling so trapped, and it's so hard to go off script. I feel trapped and stuck in everything that's going on, and everyone's decided my life before me, before I've even had a chance to discover what I want to do. And I think that kind of dichotomy where young people are put in this position where we're supposed to thrive within the current capitalist system. We're supposed to kind of follow the script, go to university, if we care about the environment, study environmental studies, and that's it. And, go get a job, get a family, get a house, do all these things, check off the boxes. And on the side, create climate justice and transform the way that we live. And that's just not kind of a realistic reality to put on our young people. And I think it's a big source of the anxiety that's going on, because it's like living in two worlds at the same time. On the one hand, we see ourselves living in this collapsing society around us, but everyone's telling us it's just fine. And we have to kind of both live within the world that we want and live within this collapsing world and try and thrive according to these kind of, mainstream standards of what success looks like. And they just don't all go together. And I think a piece of this conversation, particularly for those of us that are adults and elders in this space, is how do we create spaces for young people to actually tap into their passion? And what are their gifts that they're able to bring to this crisis? And how do we uplift that? I think listening to a lot of Indigenous youth leaders around climate justice, I often hear from, for example, Autumn Pelletier, who says, this is my purpose. This is why I came to this earth, to come and with my generation to solve this crisis and move humanity into a peaceful and just way of living. And I think kind of creating that space for young people to be able to find their path, we don't do that in schools right now. We say, complete these studies, pass these tests, and then kind of decide on your degree. But there's no real space for guidance and support around, what do I want to do with my life? And particularly in relation to this broad looming crisis that is just over my future. And I think if we can start as that support system around young people to reconcile that and to create spaces to say, well, okay, yeah, it's hard to find career paths in climate justice where you can, not be in the depths of poverty and still be pursuing your values and what you believe in this world. And what does it mean to open up different ways of resource sharing across generations? What does it mean to open up different paths of connecting with mentors and getting back to kind of some apprenticeships where we can learn from the experiences of those that have been trying to achieve climate justice for generations and, start a little bit further down the path rather than young people having to figure it out from scratch all over again. I feel like maybe I'm going off the anxiety point, but that to me is like, if we're talking about action, like we need to talk about where do we all kind of fit within this crisis and how does our mosaic of strengths fit together? Because another piece of this anxiety is very much that kind of superhero narrative that gets put onto climate justice and all things changing society, right? Nobody cares. This is the crisis. The whole world is, in deep crisis. We're facing the apocalypse. You alone must solve it. You have to come up with the perfect idea that's going to come and solve the crisis and pull us all up out of this thing and make it all better. And that's a lot of pressure. And it's not true either, because there are millions of us around the world at this point that want to see climate justice, that want to see a transformation of the world, that the ways that we live. And, being able to identify that it's actually in all of our strengths coming together. I might have just this one tiny piece of the puzzle and that's enough, because we can come together and build from our strengths and be able to kind of address this as communities, looking towards multiple ways of future living. So I'll leave it there, but yeah, those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Roxy. Does anyone else want to jump in on that before we move on?
Sorry, I don't know if I...
Oh, go first, you go first.
Thank you. I just found the point about you go through school and you get all these tests and assessments done, and then you're kind of like, okay, where's the part to put the pieces together and to find your own interest? Really interesting, because I fully understand that and see that, because speaking to a lot of kids in my grade, let's say, or just in the halls, it's a lot of we have career studies projects, and then we start having conversations about what do you want to do when you grow up or whatever. And it's interesting because half of the students are like, I don't know what I want to do. I mean, I like doing this, but can I make a good career out of this? Or is this something really suitable for what I want to look like in the future? So I think that's really interesting, and definitely not talked about enough at all. And especially tying that into the environment, you have these extra concerns loaded onto, is this really what I want to do about the state of the planet, which is like a big giant question where you're like, how do I answer that? What do I say? So yeah, I just really found that point interesting.
Danielle, did you want to add on there?
Oh yeah, I just wanted to mention that really resonated in the sense of, I know this is what I want to do. I want to work to help mitigate the climate catastrophe. But at the same time, it's like the schoolwork that I'm doing right now, studying for my chemistry midterm on Monday, true story, has never felt more fulfilling than when I'm working with other youth organizers and having discussions and planning a rally or coordinating the care program. That all feels very filling and meaningful to me. But then it's sort of like you're put on this path of get your degree, get a job, and then you can worry about it. Whereas I want to do something right now, but what I'm studying to do in the future doesn't fulfill me the same way, if that makes sense. So I really resonate with that.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think what you guys are saying about kind of fitting all those pieces together. In our resource page, we actually have, and maybe you've seen this already, the Venn diagram from Dr. Anna Johnson about how to take climate action, how to get involved in the movement, and her point is, we're in it for the long haul. This is the work of our lifetimes, and we need to make sure that we're doing work that's sustainable so we're bringing in our own gifts, we're bringing in our own talents, our own passions, and we're doing it in a way that kind of makes sense in our lives, right? Without that huge pressure. And not only a huge question for youth who are sort of figuring out their lives, but it's a great question for all of us, right? For people like John Paul or myself who are trying to find their way into this movement. So really great points. Thank you. I have another question here for everybody on the panel. So please jump in, anybody, or I'll ask you. But so there's been some criticism of the word eco-anxiety because, and I'm quoting an article here by Isabel Whitcomb, which you can find in the resource page. The quote here from her is, it doesn't get at the immediacy and the specificity of the threats people are actually facing today, or the vast discrepancy between lived experiences. The compound threats of colonialism and resource scarcity, the grief over having to rebuild a home lost to megafire, guilt over flying or eating meat. The term climate anxiety lumps these experiences all together when they are obviously not equivalent. So when you're using, what she's really saying here is when you're using a term like eco-anxiety or climate anxiety, it's so generalized, it's actually erasing the experiences of marginalized communities. And it sort of keeps us stuck in our own boxes of understanding. So that's a lot, but I'm just gonna ask all of you, is this something that comes up in your school, in your organizations, with peers or with colleagues when you're discussing feelings about climate change? And I'm sort of wondering if we can sort of take on some heavy lifting right now in our panel. What can we do to change our conversations about eco-anxiety so that it decenters the experience of white, wealthy communities?
I can go first if someone doesn't want to go first. I feel like I'm talking a lot, but I think so. On the point of it coming up sort of in our organizations, I had a really interesting discussion with another organizer from Fridays for Future Toronto, and he was saying exactly what you said, how eco-anxiety is actually like a very white lived experience, which I'd never sort of seen that perspective as a white person, right? But he really explained to me how, this is the first time white people have had, in the colonial sense, have had this overlooming threat to our survival, right? And so that's sort of where that feeling comes in. I thought that was a really interesting perspective to see it from. And in terms of like changing the narrative or the discussion, I thought it was really interesting how Jeff Bezos spoke at COP26 recently, lecturing others on, the fragility of the environment and blah, 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 right? Not to quote Greta Thunberg, that was unintentional. But I think we have to change the conversation again to encompass everyone's experiences in terms of like, you're not responsible for the climate crisis if you're eating meat, right? That's the people who have the most privilege in terms of wealth and time should be the ones who are fostering and helping communities build together to create climate action, I think.
Thanks, Danielle.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I really affirm what you were just sharing, Danielle. And I think for me, when I think about anxiety, I often think about it as a psychological disorder that affects an individual. And that individual has to build their own resilient strategies to better manage their emotions and deal with everyday life. And I think that when we look at it from that kind of psychological lens, which it is a psychological term, I mean, it's so individualized, and it again places this kind of responsibility on the individual to fix their own emotional state, when that's really not the issue here. The issue is, yes, we all need to learn to have better emotional stability and process our emotions. That's been missing in our school system for sure. But like, this is not a case of some young people feeling anxious about their world. It's about, you know, the destruction that's going on that has those, as you know, Danielle was saying, these kind of real impacts for a lot of communities and folks that are, you know, it reminds me of a Linda Hogan quote. She's a Chickasaw poet and writer and eco-thinker. And she says, you know, basically, like, here's a lesson. What happens to Earth and what happens to people is the same thing, right? And recognizing, like, our planet is going through a kind of level of anxiety that we are experiencing with it. And that it is not so much anxiety, but like genuine worry that comes from kind of these real concerns. And I guess just, sorry, like a lot of points that are floating in different directions. And I think just the last thing I'll share is this, is the importance of rage in this conversation as well. You know, when we kind of loop all of these things, oh, we're afraid, we're angry, we're sad, we're anxious, we're all under the title of anxiety, it does kind of start to kind of push aside those more forceful emotions of like betrayal and straight up rage. And we have a right to feel rage. That's a really important emotion to be acknowledged here. And to me, it doesn't fit under anxiety. Like, there's eco-anxiety, there's rage. And they're both kind of legitimate. And I think there's a kind of a lot of climate emotions, and they each deserve some space. But to recognize that, like, we are sharing our emotions with the planet, with the animal world, with the plant nations right now, and that they're feeling a lot of this kind of stress that we are also feeling, and that's not kind of distinct, but that we are kind of intertwined in our emotional states as well with natural worlds.
I mean, the implication with the term is that there's something irrational going on here in some ways, that this can be managed. And like, nothing could be more rational than the response of concern, rage. I mean, all that spectrum. So I think that we have to bear that in mind. And you're right, like, it's an umbrella term that's used to encompass a myriad of responses to a myriad of people, and it's not actually all that helpful. I'm not sure where to take it from there.
That's great. Thanks, John Paul. Any other of our panelists want to add anything there?
I guess just on the point of, you know, how do we decenter whiteness and the white experience in this conversation? I mean, it's such a simple reply, but it's the only reply really, which is to, like, you know, look to the leadership of BIPOC environmental leaders and particularly Indigenous youth. And I think paying attention to the specific questions that they're asking are really important for all of us to take up. You know, questions I hear Indigenous youth in the Takaranto region asking, you know, include like, when is Lake Ontario going to be drinkable again? This was not always polluted water. When can we drink from our lake again? You know, and where are our treaty relations? How are we healing our relationship with the land on a personal, on a community level? And I think kind of feeling our emotions, but orienting them in terms of our action and really taking guidance and direction from Indigenous leaders and Indigenous youth in particular, and taking up the questions that they're asking as questions for all of us, are an incredibly important part of kind of a global and a collective response here. So really kind of paying attention to the questions that young people are asking of all young people, and particularly BIPOC youth, and taking up those questions as our own.
Thank you, Roxy. That's so critical. I find myself right now, I'm sort of on my own, the anti-racist journey right now as a climate organizer. And one thing I've really been thinking about is like, it's just time to stop talking and start listening. You know, like you jump into the movement and you're like, let's go, let's go, let's go. And it's like, wait a minute, I need to just listen to all the other voices that have been here for much longer than me, that have, you know, like something really valuable to say. And sometimes like I'm really right now, I hear what you're saying, because I'm really trying to just to look to that leadership and to listen and to not center myself in every conversation. Yeah, so thank you for that point. I'm so glad that you jumped back in there. We do have a few minutes for audience questions. I'm hearing from Anne, our chat monitor, that there isn't any explicit question, or maybe Anne, something has come up.
No direct questions as yet. So if anyone would like to put a question in the chat, that would be great. But some great comments have been coming up about the need to hold our politicians to account, to act in community. As a comment about going vegan and considering our other than human animal relations, and how that is another animal agriculture as a contributor to climate change. And again, emphasizing the importance of really listening to and learning from Indigenous leadership as so important. So yeah, lots of great comments coming up. I was actually, can I ask a question? I was wondering, actually, I was really so impressed with all of the panelists and especially the youth panelists in your conversations about what it was like being in school, and how in school, I worry sometimes that students, particularly in high school, you're sort of cast as containers for knowledge and people who have to be instructed in certain skills, and emotion, whether it's with regard to climate or any issue, is not included in that. And so making space for emotions and relationships generally in our education system is an important part of this. Sorry, I'm not articulating that very well, but if anyone wanted to jump on that, that would be great. And again, please, for our other participants, if you have a question, put that in the chat. Thank you.
Sorry, can we just clarify the question? It's kind of just like, what is education's role in all of this emotional and relationship stuff, if I'm going to sum it up?
Yeah, sorry, I put that very well. I guess I'm thinking about how our current education system sort of constitutes students, and how there's not enough space within that for emotion in the classroom. And I know that there are some wonderful teachers out there who are doing that work of creating space for emotion, but that in our education system and in our understanding of knowledge itself, knowledge is disconnected from emotion. Like you're dumped with the climate film, but you're not being asked to process that. And so how do you reforge connections between knowledge and feelings? And how could that perhaps be helpful here? Sorry, that's a very big question, but I'm just thinking through this myself a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think a small part of that answer, but an important piece, is the body, through the body. So often, as you're saying, yeah, knowledge is disconnected from emotion, but also it's disconnected from the body and our kind of our intuition, and also our felt senses. Like, what are we actually, the sensations that we're feeling in the body? And remembering Mayan Indigenous elder Maria Montejo, she taught me in the past, my body is my first piece of earth. And if I'm to care for the earth, I also need to care for my body, and they're connected. And I think a lot when, we take young people out for land-based education around climate change, that felt sense of joy in connecting with the earth, learning from the natural world. A lot of it comes processed through our body sensations and our emotions, and those are connected. And I don't know exactly how. I mean, I think it's completely radically transforming how we measure success and knowledge in schools, and getting rid of tests or reorienting our assessments. But I think creating space to kind of acknowledge that wisdom that exists within our bodies, our ancestors, and our emotions.
Thank you. Actually, this kind of comes to our next question, and then it's very similar to the one that Allison has asked in the chat. So I'm gonna go to this one now, but it's for everybody on the panel, and I think I'm gonna go to Elliot, to you first with this one. but I would love for each of you to comment. The question is, what has helped each of you personally in moving through difficult emotions about climate change, and maybe what's helped you sustain your engagement in climate action? Allison's question was kind of, how do you make people care when their feelings are overwhelm and anxiety, right? So it's sort of like that. If you're feeling paralyzed by your feelings, sort of what's helping you to sort of get in the action and stay in the movement? Elliot, do you want to speak to that first?
Oh, sure. I mean, for me personally, what kind of got me here was a grade 8 teacher who, there was one day I remember, and I think it was like snowing in April or some crazy weather like that people were in the hallway saying, oh, and people say like that the earth is heating up, but yet we have snow in April, and they were making these small comments. And then the next day he sat us all down and he showed us science and videos, and just like you said, but instead of leaving us with that, he let us have a blank discussion for like, I don't know how long it was, but he let us just talk and just share. And I walked away from that feeling like there are adults that we can trust to let us just talk and have them talk with us. And I think in order to get people to care, like we've said a lot throughout this panel, is to really just let people talk. And that feels really silly to say out loud because it seems so simple. But if you just take away the kind of, I need to do this, 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 and this, and if I don't do this, then I'm not doing my part, instead of looking at more of a plan of action, instead of that, almost starting with just, how do you feel about these actions? How do you feel about the past? How do you feel about the future? And I think once you really get to the point of understanding how people feel, then even when I think yourself, when you understand how you really feel and talk through it, then you almost think, okay, now I care because now I understand what I've been through and what I'm thinking. So yeah, I don't know if that is a good
That's
answer.
great.
Well, yeah, that's what I have.
I love that answer. Thank you. Thank you, Elliot. John Paul, what are your thoughts on this?
I can say for me, it's been very important to be involved with 4Kids. So to find people who sort of come from a similar perspective and share similar responses and who are actually acting and doing something. So without that reinforcement, I think it's easy to get despondent and down and, take the defeats, internalize those and stop moving. So that for me has been key.
I echo that as a 4Kids member. It's the community that we find in each other. Thank you. Danielle?
Yeah, actually, all of this sort of like ties together in sort of what I was going to say, in the sense of like, I think taking a pause, taking it slow, especially for youth, this is a really big burden for young people, right? So I think like Elliot's teacher, giving students the space, or like even just your friends, if you want your friends to sort of, join the climate movement, or just trying to maintain your own motivation to go on. It's like, we're always in the mindset of go, 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 but sometimes we need the mindset of just, let's pause, and like Roxy said, and Anne said, like I said, it was all tying together. I was getting really excited, and it comes from a million different places, but like honoring our own intuition and just honoring the fact that we care in the first place is enough, right? You don't have to be the founder of this and the writer of that to have made an impact, right? Just you caring is enough. And when people listen to that, I think it's more encouraging than anything else.
Thank you, Danielle. And Roxy, I'll let you have the last word here today.
Joy is my last word. I think it's so important for us to find spaces of joy and to know that even though, especially for the young people in the room, like even though, yeah, we have the burden of this massive crisis, it's still important for you to feel good. And it's still important for you to find happiness. And that is part of your response, because your well-being is tied up in the well-being of the earth and the plants and the animal nations. And they can be that source of inspiration for you and for us, like to spend those times, even when you're in the city, to go out and just find 10 minutes to sit next to a tree and just appreciate and find those moments to be grateful for the water, grateful for the trees, for the squirrels. That is what sustains me, alongside what you've all said of action, community, finding like-minded folks, but that joy and finding joy with the natural world.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful word to end on. I just want to thank all of our panelists again today, Roxy, Elliot, John Paul, and Danielle. We so appreciate you and you being here with us and sharing your experiences and insights. I thought it was just a wonderful hour. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you to our participants for your questions, your comments. A reminder that that resource page is in the chat. So make sure you open it and save it because the chat will go away in just a minute. Thank you to Anne Curie, who was our chat monitor and helped organize today, and to Amy at Carbon Conversations TO for her support in putting together this panel. Thank you to the tech crew and Lee Adamson organizers for hosting us at the EcoFair. And lastly, if you're looking for a group to join, come check out forkids.ca. We're a nice group of people and we'd love to have you. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful afternoon and please be in touch.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.